Hi, welcome to your 6-5 flip video. 6-5 is titled Fractions, Decimals, and Percents. I'm not going to make you go through what the definition of a percent is, but in case you forgot, a percent means for every 100. And so what we're going to do in 6-5 is we're really converting fractions to decimals, decimals to percents, and percents to fractions, and vice versa. So you should be able to take any decimal and give me the fraction form of it and the percent form. You should be able to take any percent and give me the fraction form and the decimal form. You should be able to take any combination and give me the other two with ease, all right? There's one exception to this that will be a little bit more difficult, and that's repeating percents, and we'll talk about that during our next class more in depth. But for right now, you should be able to take the 3 and rotate between them easily. So, fractions, decimals, percents, how do you go between all of them? So, let's look at a specific example, because we know parts of this already. You already know how to take a fraction, make it a decimal. You know how to make a decimal, make it a percent. We have to fill in the gaps, though, okay? And notice that all of these arrows are two-way arrows, so you can go from a decimal to a fraction, or a fraction to a decimal. You can do that for any of the combination of these. It's kind of like the recycling symbol, where there's no start and no end. It just keeps going on. So, let's start with a fraction, because we're confident with fractions. We've worked with fractions a lot. 7 over 8. How do you go from a fraction to a decimal? And then just FYI, for all of this, I'm going to do fractions on top, decimals bottom right, percents bottom left, just so you're not confused as to the order. You know, it doesn't matter which one's on top or which one's to the side. Just I'm going to be consistent with that setting. So 7/8 is my fraction, so it's up top. How do you go to a decimal? Well, you're going to use long division. So to do long division, you have to know which one, the 7 or the 8, goes inside the division symbol. So you have to remember that 7/8 can be written in 3 ways. You can be first written as 7 divided by 8, or 7 over 8, the fraction form itself, or 7 divided by 8, where 7 is inside the long division symbol. So we can categorize these as the numerator in 7/8 is either the first number if you write it out sideways, the top number if you write it out as a fraction, or the inside number if you write it out as long division. Okay, so first, top, inside, all right? And this is for your numerator, so in this case, the 7. Now, if you do the long division, 7 over 8, you do the long division, you get that 7 divided by 8 is 0.875, and you get no remainder, so you know you're done. All right, so the long division tells me that 7/8 is 0.875. So now I have my decimal and I have my fraction, and I could use either one to get to my percent, but I know how to pretty quickly and pretty easily go from a decimal to a percent. I'm just going to multiply by 100. So if I take that 0.0875, I scoot my decimal point 2 to the right, I get 87.5%. That's nice and easy. All right, so now we just need to close the last gap. How do you go from percent to fraction? Well, what you're going to do is you're going to write it out. So I didn't show this, and let me add this here now. If you have 87.5% here, that's 87.5 over 100. You can't have a decimal within a fraction. That's a complex fraction. We talked about that in topic 5. So I'm going to move my decimal point 1 to the right. So my decimal point would be right here, and I move it 1 to the right, which would give me 875 over 1,000. So I kind of skipped to that step right off the bat. So you start off with 8. You take your decimal, your percent. So in this case, it's 87.5, and just do 87.5 over 100 because it's a percent, and percent means for every 100. So I have 87.5 things for every 100 things, but you can't have that decimal, so you got to scoot it over. So the more decimals you have, let's say this was 52.52, I need to scoot it over twice. So the more decimals you have, the bigger your denominator is going to be, okay? But in this case, it's just that 0.5, so I'm going to take that decimal, scoot it over once, and that gives me that 875 over 1,000. From there, it's just simplification. What can you pull out of 875 and 1,000? Well, I can pull a 25 out of both. 875 divided by 25 gives me 35. 1,000 divided by 25 gives me 40. I can still simplify. What do you pull out of 35 and 40? You can pull out of 5. 35 divided by 5 is 7. 40 divided by 5 is 8. and the cycle is complete. I went all the way from a fraction to a decimal to a percent back to a fraction. All right? Now let's look at it from using another path, okay? Oh, and then explanation. How do you go from a percent to a fraction? You're going to write it as a fraction over 100 and then simplify, okay? So now, let's say I give you the fraction 3/16. Let's go the opposite direction this time. How do you go from 3/16 to a percent? Hold on. So what you're going to do, I know percent means over 100. For every 100. So my denominator is going to have to be 100. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale up my current denominator of 16 up to a multiple of 100. And the reason I want to do this is because if it's a multiple of 100, then I can scale it down to exactly 100. So what do I mean by this? So if I take 3 over 16 and I scale it up to a multiple of 100, so 16 times 100, I get 300 over 1,600, okay? Now, I know that a percent means over 100, and I can go from 1,600 to 100 pretty easily. I'm just going to divide the denominator by 16, because 1,600 divided by 16 is 100. So if I do it to the bottom, I'm also going to do it to the top. 1,600 divided by 16 is 100. 300 divided by 16 is 18.75. And I know I just said you can't have a decimal inside a fraction, but this one is fine because I just am using this as a relationship to show that it's 18.75 for every 100, so my percent is 18.75%. All right? So I'm not really using, and I know this is a weird way of phrasing it, I'm not using this fraction, I'm just using it as a reference point. I'm not saying 18.75 over 100. I'm saying 18.75 over 100 tells me 18.75%. 18.75 over 100 is not a good final answer, but it's a good in-between step. Okay, so now I have 18.75%. How do you go from a percent to a decimal? Well, you divide by 100, because the other way, from a decimal to a percent, you multiply by 100. So if I take that 18.75, I move my decimal point 2 to the left, same thing as dividing by 100, I get 0.1875. Nice and easy. Complete the circuit, find that final leg. How do you go from 0.1875 to a fraction? Well, you're going to read it aloud and create a fraction, then scale it down. So I would read 0.1875 as 1,875 10,000ths, because this is the 10th spot, the 100th spot, the 1,000th spot, the 10,000th spot. So this is 1,875 10,000ths, all right? So, and I take that and turn it into a fraction. So 1,875 over 10,000, and then I can simplify from that. So what can I pull out of both of those? Well, I see they both end with 75 or 00, so I can pull out a 25 from both. 1,875 divided by 25 is 75. 10,000 divided by 25 is 400. I can pull a 25 out of both of them again, which gives me 3 over 16, which is my fraction that I originally started with. All right, so if you get a different answer at some point, or if you complete the circuit and you don't get the same number that you started, you did something wrong at some point. So I know there's a lot of rules. Let's try and formalize it. So if you have a fraction, your decimal, your percent, how do you go from one to the other? So for a fraction and decimal, you're going to use long division to go from your fraction to your decimal. We already knew that. Fraction, long division gives you your decimal. To go from your decimal to your fraction, you're going to read it aloud, create a fraction, and then simplify. All right, and that's that whole process we just looked at with reading it aloud, the 1,875 thousandths, and that gives you 1,875 over 10,000. All right, so now how do you go from a decimal to a percent? Well, this one's nice and easy. Decimal to percent, multiply by 100, percent to decimal, divide by 100. All right, now this one is probably the most tricky, but you're more than capable of doing it. How do you go from a percent to a fraction? Well, you're going to take a fraction and you're going to create a denominator over a denominator of 100 and then simplify. So if you have 16%, that's 16 over 100, so I use that x to represent your percentage, so 16 over 100 in this case, and then you would simplify to whatever that'd be, 8 over 50, 4 over 25, okay? To go from a fraction to a percent, you're going to scale up your denominator to a multiple of 100 and then reduce to exactly 100, all right? And this was the example we looked at here with the 316, I multiply by 100 to get me 300 over 1600, divide both of them by 16 to get a denominator of 8 of 100, because I know percent means for every 100, all right? So we can do all of this. We can go any direction now, all right? So let's look at some examples. So I have fraction, decimal, percent, and I'm giving you one of each. Let's look at the fraction. How do you go from a fraction to a decimal? You're going to use long division, so 1 divided by 2. I know I picked an easy one here. 1 divided by 2 gives you 0.5, so the fraction form of the decimal form of the fraction 1 over 2 is 0.5. How do you go from a decimal to a percent? You're going to move it over 2 to the right, aka multiply by 100, get 50%. I just realized 3/4 is not a decimal, so let's change that to be 0.48. Well, I know, let's do the easy one first. I know a decimal to a percent, that's a nice easy transition. You just multiply by 100, so 48%. Now I have two methods I could use to get to a fraction. I could do percent to fraction or decimal to fraction. I like doing decimal to fraction. So you know what? Let's do percent to fraction. 48% means 48 over 100. So I'm going to simplify, divide by 2. 48 divided by 2 is 24, 100 divided by 2 is 50, divide by 2 again, I get 12 over 25. My fraction form of 0.48 is 12 over 25, all right? Last one, 12%. Well, I know how to do a percent to a decimal pretty easily. I know 12% is 0.12, and I'm just going to take that, 12% is 12.0. I'm going to move my decimal point 2 to the left because I'm dividing by 100, so I get 0.12. 12% is 0.12 in decimal form. Now I have, again, two methods I could use to go from the decimal to the fraction or the percent to the fraction. So let's do 0.12. So last time I did percent to fraction, I did 48 over 100. And then I simplified to my fraction. This time, let's do decimal to a fraction. So 0.12 over 1, because 0.12 is the same thing as 0.12 divided by 1, because any number divided by 1 is that same number. So I can do 0.12 over 1. Can't have a decimal in a fraction, so I'm going to scoot my decimal point 2 to the right, aka multiply by 100. 0.12 times 100 gives me 12. 1 times 100 gives me 100. And now I can simplify. 12 over 100, I can pull a 2 out of both. 6 over 50, pull a 2 out of both again. 3 over 25. So I can now, no matter what method I choose, I can go from a fraction to a decimal to a percent, or a percent to a decimal to a fraction, or a decimal to a percent to a fraction, or any combination, all right? And that's the heart of 7 or 6-5. It's just being able to convert between the three with ease, all right? If you're not so strong going from a percent to, or a fraction to a percent, and you don't like the whole scaling up to a multiple of 100 and then reducing it to your denominator of being exactly 100, you don't have to take that route. Just like we saw at the beginning, you can go any way. There's multiple paths. So if you don't want to do the fraction to the percent, do fraction to decimal and then decimal to percent. You get to the same place. It's more work, but you get to the same place, and that's all that matters, all right? So if you can convert a fraction to a decimal or a percent, and any combination of those, you have mastered 6.65. Let me know if you have any questions.